The clutch system for a Mirage Drive 360 is comprised of the lower clutch assembly and the clutch belt drum. To replace these, you're going to want a 3/16, 5/32, and 7/64 hex key, as well as a 5/16 wrench. A small 5/32 hex key is useful for adjusting the clutch bolts, and you're also going to need some blue or red Loctite. First step is to remove the 3 main bolts on the well. The front 2 are 3/16. You don't need to remove them from the plastic piece, just make sure they're completely unscrewed from the well, from the hull itself. The back is 5/32. Okay, now those are all unscrewed. I can go ahead and unscrew the 2 main clutch bolts. These will need to be unscrewed completely and removed from the well. Once those are removed, take one of your T-handles or hex keys and just go ahead and insert it in this space here between the clutch and the well. And just leverage it slightly and push on the gear just to allow for the well to come up. I'm gonna put that aside for now. To remove the clutch, you can see it's already falling off, but you can just pivot this piece slightly sideways, the clamshell, and then it'll drop out completely. To remove the clamshell, you're going to need your 7/64 hex key. And in this case, we have a small zip tie holding these 2 sides of the clamshell together. You can just slide that off like this and leave it there. I'm disconnecting the clamshell to be able to remove the clutch belt drum. Once you have those 2 screws out, be careful because you may drop some pieces as this comes apart. So the easiest thing to do is to support the bottom side of it, pull up on the clamshell, put that piece aside, and then push on the 2 pins for the pulleys and pull down and remove that part. And now you can access the clutch belt drum. So I'll go ahead and put the old clutch aside. Now that you have everything apart, you can take the new assembly and start putting it onto the kayak. One note is that you want the black line on the compression tube to be directly on the top of the tube, which helps you to install everything because it's in its most compressed state. If it happens to be to the side and adjusted, you're going to need to reach inside the rectangular hatch with a 5/32 hex key and loosen that hex to be able to then twist the compression tube so that that black line is on the top. Once you have the black line on the top, go ahead and take the belt drum and feed it inside the loop of the belt, and make sure that you have these teeth properly engaged on the drum. Once you've done that, go ahead and take the bottom side of the clamshell with the pulleys in it, and with the belt pinched between your 2 fingers, just pop that on from the bottom side. Make sure that this compression tube spacer on the inside indexes into the little notch made for it, and that everything is sitting properly. And then go ahead and take the top side of the clamshell, and you're going to want to first engage the top of this pin with the hole in the clamshell on the left side. And once you're confident that's engaged, now that I have this pin engaged, I can tell because this side of the clamshell is touching. I take a flathead screwdriver and put it in the crack between the two sides of the clamshell and just push in slightly, which will allow that pin to engage. There you can see that side of the clamshell has closed up too. Continue to hold those pieces together because it's easy for those to fall apart, and put those two 7/64 screws back in place and tighten everything back together. Make sure when you tighten these you don't tighten them too much and strip the plastic, but you do want them to be snug. If they're loose, those pins could potentially come out and cause the system to malfunction. So you'll feel when it stops. There we go. Again, when you're done with this, just double check that both sides of the clamshell are properly locked into place. That looks good. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this zip tie and just pop it over the clamshell like that, and that's ready to go. To test to make sure everything's working properly now, I just feed this clutch in upside down just to have that shaft in place and spin it a couple times and everything seems good. So now I can go ahead and put this clutch in place. There's this tine sticking out the bottom of the belt drum, and I want to line that up in that gap in the clutch. So I just feed that in, wiggle it around. There we go, it's in place. Now pull these two screws out and put the well in. Go ahead and drop the well in place and then pull up on a part of the clutch assembly to make sure it doesn't fall down, and line up the shaft with the hole in the well and press down. Now before you tighten or attach the well bolts, you're going to want to make sure that these bolts go in properly. And before you do that, you're going to want to put some red or blue Loctite on them. The fact that these two bolts don't get tightened down all the way means that there's a chance for them to back out. So it's important that you have something binding them in place. One. Okay, go ahead and take your 5/32 hex wrench and screw those in. They don't have to be completely tight. You just want to make sure you've got them engaging the nut before tightening the other 3 bolts on the well. Okay, those are good. So I'll go ahead and start with these 2 front 3/16 hexes. And I won't tighten them all the way until I'm sure all 3 of them are engaged in the threads. There we go. Sometimes it helps to just wiggle it around a little bit. Tighten this 5/32 one on the back. There we go. So now that they're all engaged, I can go ahead and tighten all of these. Now that the 3 main bolts are tight, you can go ahead and start adjusting the clutch and the compression tube. There are 3 adjustments on the clutch: the rear clutch bolt, the front clutch bolt, and the brace screw on the back. The rear clutch bolt, which is closer to the stern of the kayak, can be adjusted to change where this gear resides compared to the gear on the drive. If it's tight to pull the drive in and out as you release it from the hull, or if you're finding there's extra friction when you steer, it might mean that these 2 gears are pushing too hard against each other. So backing this screw off by as far as 3 turns will allow this gear to move away from the drive. The front clutch bolt is the clutch slip. And what it does is, as you tighten it, it clamps the clutch system tight. So if that's not clamped at all, it allows the whole clutch system to spin within this clamp. But tightening it locks it in place. The purpose of this is in some sort of overpowered situation where you hit the lower unit on something as you're pedaling around, or drag the boat on the beach, or any number of things. It allows the whole system to slip instead of relying on the clutch to take all of that load, and avoids potential damage to the clutch. The last adjustment is the brace screw, which is on the back side. And what that does is, in certain situations, the two gears on the system could end up starting to ramp away from each other. So under high loading, this gear may actually try to move away from the gear on the drive. And in that case, this brace screw will touch the hull of the kayak, and it'll brace it against the hull and stop it from moving away from the other gear and potentially skipping. Now that everything's installed, we can use the drive to properly adjust the clutch system and the steering system. Go ahead and start with the clutch. And the first step is to put the drive in place. And then with the release handle released, pull up on the drive and see if it's difficult to remove. If it is, which this one is, it's likely that there's too much force between the gear on the drive and the gear on the clutch. And that's because this rear bolt is too tight. Loosening that bolt will allow that clutch gear to move away from the drive. So I'll go ahead and move that one turn, push it in a little bit. You heard that click. That's just that thread on that bolt pushing back into the hole. And I'll go ahead and test it again. That feels much better. I think I'll release it another half a turn. Try it one more time. Again, pushing on the gear a bit to make sure it's seated further away from the drive. Yeah, that's nice. Basically, it should be just the weight of the drive to pull it up, or just a little bit more. But if you're feeling like it's really stuck at first, then it's likely that that friction is due to those gears binding on each other. Now that that's adjusted, we're going to adjust the clutch brace screw, which is on the back side of the clutch system. And for this, you're going to want the drive installed. And what you want to see is, as you install the drive, that clutch gear will move a little bit away from the gear on the drive. It'll press against it. And as that happens, the whole clutch system moves towards the side of the hull. And you'll see that screw that comes out of the back side of the clutch move closer to the plastic of the kayak. And what you're looking for is, you want that screw to just barely be touching the kayak. So when the drive's out, it shouldn't be touching. And when it's in, it should just move a tiny bit closer. And in this case, it looks really good right now. But if you need to make any adjustments, you take a 5/16 wrench, feed it in through this crack, and if you need to move it closer to the well or to the hull, you back it off like this. If you need to move it away, if it's binding, you can tighten it again and it'll pull back towards the clutch mechanism. The last adjustment to make on the clutch is the front clutch bolt. But that can't be done until you're on the water. What you want is, you want it to be loose enough that in the case of hitting something underwater, or dragging the boat on the beach, or somebody grabbing the lower unit, you want that whole thing to be able to slip. And when that happens, like I'm pulling on the lower unit right now, you can see the indicator moving, you can see the handle moving, and that's bypassing the clutch. So if I tighten it up, one turn, let's say, or half a turn, and I try to do that again, it's much stiffer, it's much harder for me to turn. So the idea is, as you're pedaling at a brisk pace, you don't want the drive to move back and forth. You don't want to see that indicator move 30 degrees back and forth every time you pedal. So if you see that happening, you tighten it a quarter turn and you retest it. In this case, I had it tightened all the way, backed it off about 1 turn, and that's a good place to then take it to the water and try it out and see how it works. If you then need to tighten it because the drive's moving on its own, you tighten it a quarter turn, test it again, tighten a quarter turn if necessary, and then you're good to go. After you finish adjusting the clutch system, you can adjust the compression tube to get the proper tension on the steering belt. You should have assembled it with the black line facing up on the compression tube, and that means it's in its most compressed state. Normally you're going to be adjusting this somewhere between 45 and 90 degrees. And the way to do that is to open the center hatch and reach inside. And in this case, we're going to be adjusting that line so it's pointing out to the left side of the kayak. You want to do that just because it's easier to see it. If you were to adjust it the other way, it would still tension the belt, but it would be harder to see that line. So to do that, I'll put my hand inside, and you want the steering box to make sure that the screw on the steering box is still loose, so it allows that compression tube to twist. I'll put my hand inside, knuckles up above the tube, and twist those knuckles away from me. And then I'll keep an eye on this, and it looks like we're at about 60 degrees. So I'll back it off just a little bit, and when I back it off, knuckles down, I find is the easiest way to do it. So we'll start there. We'll start at about 45 degrees and see how that feels. So what I'm going to do is put the drive in place, and then go ahead and use the steering. What I'm looking for is any sort of locking or binding or ratcheting noise, which would mean that those teeth on the belt are catching that internal spacer or one of the end components. It feels pretty good. There we go, I got it to lock up. So that means we need to put a little bit more tension on it. So right now we're at about 80 degrees, which means that the line is almost totally on the side of that tube. Try it now. The downside to over-tensioning it would be you're going to start to feel more friction in the steering system because of all that tension adding to the friction. Again, I'll just be a little bit more violent with this and see how it is. If you feel it catch, you don't want to then grab this and try to force it, because that could actually damage the system. So what you're looking to do is just put some force on it and see if anything happens. That feels really good, so I'm going to leave that there. The last step with that is to go ahead and tighten the 5/32 bolt on the compression tube or on the steering box, and that'll just make sure that it stays where we set it. And it'll also keep the steering box in line with the compression tube. All right, that's nice and snug. That feels good. Now that we've got everything reassembled and adjusted, just keep in mind that the first time out in the water, whether you water test it or whether it's the customer, you may need to make some more adjustments to the clutch slip or the compression tube. So keep an eye and ear out for any strange movements from the drive as you pedal, any motion back and forth. You may need to tighten the clutch slip slightly, or with the steering system. If you're hearing any irregular noises or if it's catching or binding, you may need to tighten the compression tube to get the proper tension in the steering belt. So keep the 5/32 key with you on the water, or inform the customer of those adjustments that might need to be made.